Another day, another clickbait article from the Daily Mail about plant-based meats. They state that plant-based meats increase the risk of diabetes and heart problems based on a new study. The study was an 8-week randomized controlled trial, including 89 participants who were considered at high risk of developing type 2 diabetes. They were randomized to consume 6 types of meat or plant-based meats and were provided those foods every 3 days. At 8 weeks, there were no significant differences in total LDL or HDL cholesterol or triglycerides, which isn't all that surprising since the differences in fiber and cholesterol intake were fairly modest and there weren't any significant differences in saturated or polyunsaturated fat intake. This is in part due to some of the plant-based meats they chose to use being similar in fat content to regular meat, although there are options on the market that are far lower in saturated fat. There were also no significant differences in CRP levels, which is a marker of inflammation, or systolic blood pressure, which is the higher number on a blood pressure reading. However, those in the plant-based group did end up with a slightly lower diastolic blood pressure, which is the lower number than the meat group, but the Daily Mail didn't mention that. In fact, the Daily Mail even suggested that plant-based meats could raise blood pressure due to their salt content, even though not a single trial on the topic has shown that, and this study suggested the opposite, if anything. Now for the concerns about diabetes. There were no significant differences in fasting blood glucose, insulin, or HOMA-IR, which is an estimate of insulin resistance. However, a portion of the participants volunteered to wear continuous glucose monitors, and those in the meat group spent a little more time within the specified range of glucose levels. And this is likely because the plant-based meats contain some carbohydrates, so after meals their glucose levels rose a little bit more, but then they fell right back down, which is normal. It's also not clear how informative this data even is for people without type 2 diabetes because most of the research has been done in people with diabetes. And the target that is typically set for people with diabetes is to spend at least 70% of the time within that range of glucose levels, but in this case, both the plant-based and meat groups spent far more time in that range. And it's also important to note that not all participants were involved in this analysis using continuous glucose monitors. It was a subset of people who volunteered, and the authors of the study actually note that we should interpret these results cautiously because they weren't randomized. Now, with all of that info, the Daily Mail going on to suggest that meat eaters had a lower risk of full-blown diabetes is a stretch, to say the least. But they go further and state that these results are supported by an earlier study, but they didn't link a study to fact check. And I looked up the research on plant-based meats at the university they had mentioned, and the only study I found does not support this one bit. So I think they're either mistaken or just making it up. So to reiterate, because I know that was a lot, there were no significant differences in any markers of blood glucose control that were measured amongst the entire study population. And it's unclear how important, if at all, those differences in the CGM results even are amongst those who volunteered to wear them. And as a final note, I want to touch on the micronutrient content because the Daily Mail left that part out too. The key differences between the plant-based and animal-based meat, which were noted by the authors, were a much higher folate, calcium, and iron content in the plant-based meats and a slightly higher vitamin B12 content as well. So maybe the Daily Mail just didn't want to say the plant-based meats came out on top. So the results of this new study actually aren't that far off from previous research suggesting a relatively neutral to positive impact of swapping out animal-based meat for plant-based meat, although I would say that further research on people with or at risk of type 2 diabetes is warranted. But the bottom line is this reporting from the Daily Mail is just atrocious.